want to talk about a generation that doesn't talk about money. Not publicly, anyway. Gen X, born between 1965 and 1980, saves quietly, prepares quietly, and worries quietly. They don't post about their salary. They don't celebrate financial wins on social media. They just handle it, in the background, while everyone else is having the conversation loudly. I became genuinely curious about this a while back, because from the outside, some of their money habits look strange. The emergency fund that's never quite big enough, the deep suspicion of employers, the ability to be extremely frugal about most things and then spend seriously on one specific thing without blinking. So I started digging. I talked to people. I read about what this generation actually lived through. And every single habit stopped looking strange. Every single one made complete sense. Here's what most financial content gets wrong about Gen X. It describes their habits without explaining where they came from. It says, Gen X distrusts institutions, and moves on, as if that's just a personality trait, as if they arrived that way. They didn't. And once you understand why, you can't look at this generation the same way again. I couldn't. They didn't. Gen X came of age during one of the most economically unstable stretches in modern history, the 1980s recession, corporate downsizing on a scale nobody had seen before, the credit card explosion that buried an entire peer group in debt they didn't understand, the dot-com crash, then 2008, just as many of them were hitting their peak earning years. Every one of those events left a mark. And once you understand the marks, you understand the person. I found this out the uncomfortable way. I spent years not understanding Gen X money behavior, looking at it from the outside, applying my own framework, occasionally judging it quietly. Then I actually started asking questions. And what I heard changed how I think about money entirely. I'm not going to give you a list of Gen X traits. What I want to do is take 5 specific behaviors, the ones that look the most confusing from the outside, and show you exactly where each one came from. The event, the wound, the logic that nobody explains. Because once you see it, you won't just understand Gen X. You'll understand something about how all of us handle money. And you might recognize something in yourself you never had a name for. Let's go.
The emergency fund that's never big enough. The first thing I noticed when I started talking to Gen X people about money was the emergency fund conversation. Ask a Gen X person how much they have saved for emergencies, and they'll either tell you the exact number, down to the dollar, or they'll tell you it's still not enough. Not, I'm working on it. Not, it's pretty good. Still not enough. I asked one woman about this directly. She was in her early 50s, financially stable by any reasonable measure, genuinely doing well. I asked why the emergency fund never felt sufficient. She didn't hesitate. She said, I watched my dad lose a job he'd had for 19 years. He thought that job was permanent. It wasn't. That was it. That was the whole answer. 11 words. And it explained something I'd been misreading for years. The 1982 recession hit American families with unemployment peaking close to 11%. Factory towns, farming communities, entire industries that had employed the same families for generations, gone. Not restructured, gone. Gen X watched this as children. They watched parents who had done everything right, stayed loyal, worked hard, saved what they could, lose jobs they'd been told were secure. And the thing that left the deepest mark wasn't the job loss itself. It was what it revealed.
Security was an illusion, and you couldn't talk someone out of a reflex built at age 9 by telling them they're being irrational. That emergency fund that's never big enough isn't anxiety. It's a very rational response to a very specific lesson learned very young. But the job loss wasn't just about savings. What it did to Gen X's relationship with employers is the part that most people misread completely. They don't do loyalty, and they were right. Gen X has a reputation for being cynical about employers. They job hop. They keep their options visible. They never fully believe the company line, even when things are going well. For years, people in management circles would say this was a commitment problem, a character flaw, a generation that just didn't understand the value of loyalty. I used to half believe that. Then I started actually asking why. One of the most significant economic events nobody talks about enough is the corporate downsizing wave of the late 1980s and 1990s. Companies across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia systematically eliminated entire layers of employees. Not because those people had underperformed, but because it made the quarterly numbers look cleaner. People who had given 20 years to a company received a box and a 2-week severance. I sat with a Gen X professional once. He'd just been laid off after 11 years at the same firm. I expected anger. I expected some kind of shock at the betrayal.
He was neither. He just looked at me and said, "I always knew this was coming. I just didn't know when." That's not cynicism. That's pattern recognition built over a lifetime of watching institutional loyalty get punished. And once I understood that, I stopped calling it a character flaw entirely. But there's something else that happened during this same period that shaped Gen X in a way I found genuinely surprising. Because it looks like a contradiction until you understand the timeline. Allergic to debt, not allergic to risk. This is the Gen X money behavior that confused me the most before I understood it. They're deeply uncomfortable with consumer debt. Many Gen X adults pay off their credit card balance every single month without thinking about it. Not because they read a financial planning book, but because debt feels viscerally wrong to them. And yet, they'll invest. They'll take calculated risks. They'll put real money behind something they believe in without much hesitation. Both are true. Both feel completely natural to them. And once I understood the two events behind them, the contradiction disappeared entirely. The credit card industry exploded in the 1980s. Cards became widely accessible for the first time. Interest rates were brutal, some above 20%, and millions of people took on debt they didn't fully understand. Gen X watched older siblings, friends' parents, sometimes their own parents, get buried. Not from recklessness, from not knowing what they were walking into. I talked to someone who described watching their older brother spend 3 years unable to get ahead of a credit card balance. He'd pay it down, and it would climb back up. Every month, for years. She told me she's never carried a balance in her life. Not once. And it's not discipline. It's the memory of watching someone she loved feel trapped. But then came the dot-com era. And what Gen X saw there taught them something completely different. That calculated, eyes-open risk with money you can actually afford to lose works differently than blind consumer debt. The Gen X money code isn't avoid all risk. It's know exactly what you're risking and why. That distinction is important, and it leads directly into the habit that I think carries the most emotional weight of anything I learned researching this video. Retirement anxiety despite doing everything right. This one took me the longest to understand, and once I understood it, I felt something I didn't expect. Gen X saves for retirement consistently, more consistently than almost any other generation, and they're still anxious about it. From the outside, this looks irrational. You're doing the right things. Why isn't it enough? Because Gen X was the first generation to retire without pensions. I want to slow down on that sentence, because the first time someone said it to me, I didn't feel its full weight. Their parents largely had defined benefit pensions. Work for a company for 30 years, the company guarantees you a monthly income for life. A promise, an institution. You didn't manage it. It was just there. By the time Gen X entered the workforce,
That system was being systematically replaced with 401ks, defined contribution plans, which meant you are now responsible for your own retirement. You pick the investments. You carry the risk. You make all the decisions. Gen X didn't choose this. It happened around them while they were trying to figure out their careers, and there was no blueprint. I spoke with a Gen X woman who told me, I couldn't ask my parents how to manage a 401k. They'd never had one. I was figuring it out from scratch. She paused, then added, and the stakes were my entire retirement. That's not irrational anxiety. That's the weight of carrying something completely alone that every previous generation had institutional help with. It changed how I think about their relationship with money entirely. But there's one more habit, the one that puzzled me most at the start, that actually turned out to be the smartest thing of all. The strategic splurge nobody understands. Almost every Gen X person I talked to had a version of this, extremely frugal across the board. Then one specific thing, the car, the kitchen, the annual trip, the guitar, where the frugality rules didn't apply. And they didn't feel guilty about it at all. I used to think this was the habit that didn't fit, the contradiction that broke the pattern. It isn't. It's actually the most psychologically sophisticated thing about how Gen X handles money. When your foundational financial education is built on instability, when the lesson you learn earliest is that security can disappear and you're largely on your own, deferred gratification becomes your survival mode. You put things off. You prepare instead of enjoy. You save for a disaster that might never come. But here's what I came to understand from talking to people who actually live this. That mechanism has a cost. And if you never give yourself a pressure valve, it breaks you quietly over time. Gen X figured this out, often without consciously deciding to. They gave themselves one guilt-free zone, one area where the survival rules didn't apply. Not reckless spending, not denial, just a sustainable human release inside a money mindset built for hard times. One man I spoke with called it the thing that makes the rest of it worth it. His thing was a motorcycle he'd owned since his 30s. Never apologized for it. Probably never will. That's not inconsistency, that's wisdom. I went into this research expecting to find quirks, a list of behavioral patterns that looked different. What I actually found was a generation that received an incredibly hard financial education, through no choice of their own, and built something real and durable from it. The emergency fund that's never enough, the distrust of employers, the debt aversion that runs bone deep, the retirement anxiety even when the numbers are good, the one guilt-free thing that holds the rest of it together. Not quirks, not flaws, a map of everything they lived through. None of it is a flaw. Every single piece of it has a direct line back to something specific this generation lived through.